Welcome everybody to the Bren PhD Symposium. I have the distinct honor and privilege of going first, which is always an exciting challenge. And I love this presentation because this symposium because it gets to show high caliber and exciting research. And I think nothing says that so the most fun possible manner than theoretical math. So my research is about how fishery managers can provide or maybe change their management style if you provide fishers with an index insurance policy. As many of you may be aware, fisheries are highly vulnerable to environmental shocks. Up north in Mendocino County, in 2018, their uni fishery was brought by a devastating collapse in catch. 80% of their uni disappeared. And it originated from an anomalous warm water blob that led to an explosion of purple sea urchin, which then fed on the kelp, devastating the kelp, which the more high-value uni fisheries also feed on. Without the kelp, the population collapsed. The community was devastated by this loss. Millions of dollars were gone from the community. The divers that seek out the uni, they have to pursue more deadly and dangerous strategies by diving deeper to try to find uni any way they can. This type of shocks and risks are detrimental to these communities, but they're not ubiquitous. They're ubiquitous and not solely isolated in just Mendocino County. The way we can balance out some of this risk around the world is generally through the use of management. Management can either be a government organization or a collection of people in fishery communities banding together to define the rules that are going to help establish and protect the long-term biological and economic sustainability. The way management often works is they use science to try to best predict the stock sizes and have an understanding of the biological system. As our observer friend is taking important data on fish stocks to help inform policies. Those policies then create binding rules that are going to constrain fisher behavior in order to alleviate the tension of the race of fish. So often the communities of fishers, there's a pressure to try to extract as much fish as they can, which degrades the long-term sustainability. Management is designed to try to balance that. One of the most powerful and common rules that allows management to alleviate this race of fish is through harvest control rules. Harvest control rules are simply policy functions that determine the amount of catch given an observed stock level. There are a multitude of options for harvest control rules that a manager can pursue. I want to just break down how these work as we'll see these later on in the presentation. We see on the x-axis in each panel the level of biomass. So the more fish that there are in the ocean, the more are on the right side, the more fish there are in the ocean. Obviously to the left, there's less fish. When we look at the top panel, it looks at what's called the fishing mortality rate. The fishing mortality rate is simply the proportion of catch that's allowed if we observe a level of stock. So if we see a level of stock of 1,000, the fishing mortality rate says we should be able to catch half that. The bottom panel is an annual catch limit. This is the binding quota and the restriction upon which fishers can operate. The annual catch limit is simply the fishing mortality rate times the biomass. So we have that 1,000 fish on harvest control rule says we can only harvest half. The fishers are only limited to catch 500 fish. Harvest control rules help protect against risks by allowing the stock to recover if an environmental shock hits it and pushes it into a low environment. We reduce fishing pressures, it allows the stock to grow. The problem when that occurs, though, is this reduction in quotas are immensely unpopular and they can lead to immediate losses of income for the fishers. Even though these policies are designed to promote the long-term sustainability, the short-term tension is palpable between the managers and the fishers. One tool that we think might be able to address and alleviate some of this income shock for the fishers is index insurance. Index insurance, given the name, it's using an index to define an insurance payout. Now that index can be a representation of an anomalous weather event. So in the case of our Mendocino County, a large warm water event occurred that pushed sea surface temperature too high. That led to a loss of income for the fishers because of the devastation of the stock. With income, the insurance is going to pay out and help smooth that tension. So pay back and compensate fishers for that loss. In the good years, the fishers will then pay into the fund to make sure that it remains liquid. What I started thinking about is we know that index insurance and all insurance policies actually have a tendency to change people's behaviors. So I started thinking, would index insurance actually kind of ameliorate this tension between the long-term viewpoint of the managers and the short-term needs of fishing communities? And if the managers take that into consideration, would they actually pursue different harvest policies? maybe they now pursue more aggressive conservation measures because they are not facing as much political pressure as they are with the insurance policy. So my formal research questions are building off that, but kind of defining in a more rigorous manner. It's saying, would a manager change their harvest control rules if fishers were protected by an index insurance policy? My second question then says, if we see a change in these harvest control rules, are we going to see a change in the long-term biological sustainability? Does the harvest practice change, and does that lead to more conservation or potentially even less? Third, I then say, okay, with these changes in the underlying stock, do we see changes in the communities? Are the communities better off with insurance and the updated harvest control rules? To go about solving this question, I use math to solve this statement. Everyone kind of panicked a little bit. Don't worry. I'm not going to show any equations, but we're going to break down this statement so we can understand the intuition of what I'm trying to accomplish. So the statement I'm trying to solve is the manager maximizes the infinite sum of expected utility of risk-averse fishers. A lot of work there. Break it down. So first, utility. Utility is an economist's favorite tool to measure satisfaction. It's preferred over something as income or profit because it allows us to understand risk preferences. And risk preferences are essentially like a manner of how much do I like or dislike risk. And I specify my fishers to be risk averse, which is an indication that they don't like risky outcomes. They find them unsatisfactory. And I think that's an important consideration. And most of us will all agree in this room, we would rather have stable incomes than ones that fluctuate each year. Like, could you imagine if Bren rolled the dice on your paycheck and said, yep, you're getting paid $10,000 or $1,000? I don't think that'd be very popular with the people. So there's a level of risk aversion that people intuitively have around their income. The manager is going to be acting as like the sole planner to say, I'm going to account for my fisher's utility and the risk averse behavior, and I'm going to choose how much should they be allowed to fish, essentially establishing the harvest control rule that maximizes this long-term utility for the fishers. I'm going to focus on the infinite sum because I want these managers to look far into the future. I want them to consider the biological dynamics and allow them to grow over time. The next part is the expected. We live in a random world, and so I'm going to add weather shocks that are going to hit the biomass and change it in a given year. This is a representation of like that marine heat wave that we saw, and so we're adding stochasticity. Managers are going to create expectations on how they think the world will act and will look, and they're going to use that to project the utility for risk-averse fishers. The final step, and this is my novel edition, is I'm going to add an insurance contract on top of this statement. I'm going to turn the insurance contract on and off to see what are the differences between the harvest control rules with and without insurance. When I solve this, I end up identifying three distinct effects: a wealth effect, a smoothing effect, and the insurance effect. The wealth and smoothing effects are two well-known phenomena from the economics literature. The wealth effect is related to what's called the shadow value of a fish, essentially a representation of if I leave a fish in the ocean now, how much more valuable will that fish and its offspring be as it grows? And so that's a capturing and saying, I don't necessarily want to extract all my fish now. Maybe I want to leave some of it into the future to grow. The smoothing effect comes in from the risk-averse tendencies of the fishes. So that smoothing effect allows the fishers to want to try to balance their income and their harvest in a given year between the bad states and the good states of the weather shocks. It also smooths over time as well. Those are two phenomena that are well studied in economics, but I want to focus on what the insurance effect would be. And I do this by turning on and off the contracts. So when I combine and add the insurance into it, I can make a world where I have a no insurance situation and I have a harvest control rule dedicated in green. We can see that at low levels of biomass, we have relatively small proportions of harvest, but as we increase, we see a flattening out of the harvest. That flattening out is a smoothing effect. The low levels of biomass, the harvest at low levels of biomass is a consequence of the wealth effect. Now, when I add the insurance contract on top of that, I see that it changes this policy slightly, but in very crucial ways. Maybe counterintuitively and surprisingly, the insurance actually might incentivize the manager to choose a more aggressive harvesting policy at lower levels of biomass. They compensate that with a reduction in harvest at larger levels of biomass. Now, even though this may seem counterintuitive, insurance has a well-known phenomenon that it increases people's propensity to take on risk. If you feel protected from risk, insurance makes you feel more confident in taking that risk. So I believe that's what's explaining the slight increase on the left-hand side. But we also need to account for the magnitude. As you may be aware, we're seeing just a very small difference in between these curves. So really, at most, we're seeing about a 2% increase or decrease at maximum along these curves. But there's still, when biomass is getting to low stakes in the world, we really want to be careful about overfishing pressures. So I want to see if these pressures lead to long-term biological damages. In order to do that, I run a series of simulations where I take both Partis control rules, I let them work for 30 years with biological growth, and I run them 500 times with different random draws of weather shocks. When I complete the simulation, I'm left with essentially 500 ending biomass. Like, what is the biomass after the 30 years? And what we can see is there really is no difference. The distributions are almost identical between the insurance policy and the no insurance policy. So this is indicative that with these different harvest control rules, we're not seeing that there's any biological sustainability being threatened. Not necessarily improving it, but we're not seeing any detrimental harm with insurance in this space. Now, when I turn to the community welfare, though, I see that insurance significantly improves the welfare of the communities. We can see that the insurance distribution after all those different simulations shifts significantly to the right, and it also tightens. That's an indication of the smoothing effect that insurance has. Insurance balances from good states and bad states to a more even nature, and because we're risk averse, we like that evenness, and so we see that tightening and we see that shift to the right. I want to end the presentation and make a conclusion that with this, I really believe that insurance is a way that we can complement fisheries management. We can help provide the needed financial support for the communities, and we will not compromise biological sustainability. Now, I have many future steps to uncover, but I'm going to leave that for the questions for the judges and the audience. But thank you very much.
We have time for one question.
I'm curious whether the insurance would be like commercial insurance where there would be a for-profit incentive to provide the insurance, or an industry insurance, and how that increased cost imposed by like a for-profit insurance might affect the model.
So in my model, I find insurance being called actuarially fair. So the payments balance out the net expected income. So really, it's like a net zero profit for the insurance. I can add additions into, like, basically adding insurance to allow them to charge higher premiums to compensate and make profit. When I do that, it doesn't change any of the behavior side for the manager, but it does change the utility of the fisher slightly. But we do allow for like complete profit maximizations by the insurance policy. It may erode some of the gains of the fishing communities. Truth be told, this is also in conjunction. We look at this compared to agricultural insurance, where they subsidize it heavily. The subsidies would actually push that utility gain that I see further to the right. So it's depending on what kind of policy we'll eventually put in place. But the way I have it now, it essentially is a private insurance offer. Just they're not necessarily making profit, they're breaking even.
Thank you.